Good evening and welcome to the Pittsburgh Public Schools Education Committee meeting. It is Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025. My name is Tracy Reed and I am Chair of the Education Committee. Tonight we have one item on the agenda. Ben Mackey from the Council of the Great City Schools will present our community listening sessions summary. I will now turn the meeting over to Mr. Mackey.
Thank you, Director Reed. Good evening, Pittsburgh Public Schools Board of Directors. It is an honor to be with you today, and happy summer. I don't know how it feels in Pittsburgh, but in Texas it is hot. I am super excited to be with you all tonight. You all have been doing a ton of work. I know you have been out and about in the community for a number of reasons throughout the entire year. Most recently, to conduct the Pittsburgh Public Schools community listening sessions, which included a number of in-person, I think it was 10 in-person community meetings, multiple virtual meetings, and then also had a survey open the entire time. Today, my goal is to overview the summary of what was heard, though my summary is from what was all recorded by the individuals and the participants themselves. And so you, of course, having run these meetings, also you have heard, hopefully it sounds pretty similar, but also I'm sure you heard different nuances depending on where you were at. And just to reorient everyone before we get into the work, the goal of this listening was to truly hear from the community as a board, asking the same question in different parts of the city to really understand, what does our community want for our students going forward? What do we want them, if they could achieve nothing else from Pittsburgh Public Schools, what do we want them to achieve? And then as we pursue that vision, what must we as a school system not sacrifice as we move in that direction, the values of the community? And the goal for this board is to be able to take that in one hand, hold it in your head. You hear it every day in your neighborhoods, in your discussions. You've heard it at the community listening sessions. Put that together with what you see in the data and what your superintendent and your administration is saying, hey, here are some key levers, and look for a way, and the work we will do going forward over the coming months is to facilitate a workshop where this board will set its priorities over the coming 3 to 5 year period, whatever this board decides to do. Both in terms of those outcomes, what do we want students to know and be able to do? But also, what are the values that we've heard from our community and we know we must maintain as we pursue those? So that's kind of the direction. This is one half of it. The other half is, again, what's coming from your administration. And it's my understanding that per his contract, the superintendent has submitted goals as is required. And that's a great starting point for this conversation that the board and Dr. Walters will eventually have as you all come to decide on what these priorities are that's going to drive the work of our system going forward. So before I get in, the way I structure this, I'm going to share kind of an overview and walk through the data summary sheet that everyone should have received, and it should be fully public. And then I'm going to ask a few questions and have you all respond and react and discuss what you're hearing, what jives with what you've currently heard, what's different, what's surprising. And there's no action today. It's really just a discussion and a presentation about what we heard from the community to make sure that it is reflective based on what we've heard. And then we're going to put that to the side, and people both in the community as well as on this board are going to think about that and use that as a foundational element when we go to set in the priorities. So before I jump into overviewing and then the questions and discussion, let me just pause and see if anyone has any thoughts or questions. I'd love to open it up first before I go through that. All right. I'm not seeing anyone. I think everyone is just ready for it potentially. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. I sent a request to share my screen. So I think control room might need to approve me. There we go. And you should be seeing a PDF document here. And I'll try to be brief. I can sometimes talk too much. So I'm going to first overview kind of what happened. Some of this I already mentioned. This board conducted 10 in-person meetings. There were 2 virtual meetings, and there was a survey, all of which asked the same questions. And the goal was to get consistency in the types of responses so we could actually compare and see what's coming up more or less. The first 2 questions that were asked centered around, what do we want kids from Pittsburgh Public Schools to know or be able to do? So we asked anyone, everything was fully open-ended so people could share whatever was on their heart and minds. What are the most important things that Pittsburgh Public School students should know and be able to do because of their time here? And then once generally a list was generated from that, a whole bunch of things we want kids from Pittsburgh Public Schools to know and be able to do, then you will ask the community in their groups or individually on the survey that if you could only choose 2 of those, which 2 would they be? Which would be the priorities? And they would circle them. Same thing in the same setup with the values. Okay, if that's what we want kids to be able to know and do, what are the other things that we've got to keep in mind? What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing as we focus on our priorities? And you got a whole lot of responses, all kinds of different things. And then you ask folks to, again, prioritize, no more than 2. Because, again, it's necessary that a board prioritizes its priorities, because if everything's important, nothing is important. We kept information, and folks were kind enough to fill out the survey saying how they were related to Pittsburgh Public Schools and where they live. This was a request from this board. So what you see is a distribution of zip codes. We had a large number of zip codes represented, but some only by one time, up to 7 from one particular zip code. And then we had a few other zip codes that weren't in the exact numerical order, so I kind of moved them to the side. But this just kind of gives you a sense. Again, this is from the survey respondents, so approximately 60 total people in all for that. We did not have record of zip codes from who showed up at the meetings, but our best guess is that folks who showed up at the meetings likely lived around that physical location. And then you'll see in the respondents from the survey, about 42%, 43% of the respondents of the survey identify as being a parent. We had about 22% as staff, and then 21% as a community member generally. Alumni at 6, student at 3, and other at 5. And other could have been just whatever folks wrote, whether it's a grandparent or whether it's a friend of a friend or something like that. So people wrote all kinds of things. All of that got categorized into other. So that's who responded to your survey. And now on to the results. The first was around vision. And the way you'll see these keywords here, and then I'll explain what they mean. The way that we organize this data is we do coding. So I personally read every single free response or what was written on the poster boards at the meetings. And then based on what was written, I was putting them into buckets around what it centered about. So for instance, academics, folks might have written, I really want my students to be able to read or learn math and history or some combination thereof. All of those, as time went on, bucketed under academics. And again, this is not just, we start with these buckets and put things in truly based on the responses. We built these categories out based on what people were saying. So what Pittsburgh Public School people who had engaged in these community listening sessions and surveys said, they essentially had academics at number 1, social skills at number 2, career at number 3, life skills followed by problem solving, financial literacy, and so on down. The 2 different graphs under each of them, the blue one represents the frequency. How many groups, how many individuals mentioned academics? If they mentioned academics, that was a check mark there. But if you remember back to the questions, you also asked folks to prioritize. You could pick no more than 2. Which 2 would you prioritize? And so the red are the number of times it was prioritized in that. So for instance, in academics, 67 either groups on the poster board paper or individuals in the survey said they prioritized academics. 45 of those 67 groups chose it as one of their top 2 priorities. So that's how to read and think about this survey. And essentially it was, we drew a line down there at about 10. So if there was for instance, someone is very passionate about thinking that students need to know driver's ed, which is a very fair thing. But it only got 1 explicit response, so it did not make this graph. So there might be some other things that were on this graph, but they were just lower than 10, so they didn't get shown here. Because the goal was to look for trends in what we're hearing from multiple communities, multiple group members, multiple folks who filled this out or attended our sessions. So if I scroll down and in this category, if you scroll, we'll pause on this next chart for a second. You'll come down to this, which actually details what is meant by those keywords. So in this instance, academics refers to academic achievement in the core subjects with a strong focus on literacy, reading and critical writing, followed by mathematics, then social studies and civics, and then science. So that notates that, while you don't have everyone coming and saying exact academics in the same way. We've tried to add some nuance in here for you all to look at and see, okay, our community definitely is saying academics, and they are prioritizing it based on the frequency of what was responded in terms of literacy, followed by mathematics, followed by social studies and science. Social skills was around developing and engaging with the broader community, learning, demonstrating citizenship, civics knowledge, social skills, networking, navigating relationships with empathy and kindness. All of these things and anything that was latently related to that got bucketed under social skills, which ended up being the second most frequently identified focus area for what we want students to know and be able to do, as well as the third most prioritized area. Following that up was career, a lot of focus and folks responding to about real world experiences, potential career exploration, opportunities for trades. Then life skills, a little bit different than career, as life skills refers to those essential real world skills like interviewing, car maintenance, home economics, professionalism, those kind of foundational ones as opposed to a specific career. And then problem solving was anything related to critical thinking, careful analysis, strong decision making, ability to break down a complex task and accomplish it. And then number 6, there was financial literacy. So specific mentions around preparing students with financial knowledge to be able to manage their own credit, taxes, have checks and credit cards, etc. So that was the summary of what we want students to know and be able to do. We want our students to be successful academically in literacy, math, and social studies. We want them to develop social skills, have access and succeed in their career paths, life skills, and so on. If we're focused on that, then there's also this values thing called guardrails, constraints, executive limitations, whatever y'all want to call them. That's what this is. These are the things that as Pittsburgh pursues those goals, what are the things we should not avoid? We should either stop doing or keep doing, even though we're pursuing our goals. And so the summary here was, again, you'll see a lot smaller font here because there are more folks that had a variety of different things. But overall, and in descending order, we saw staff experience had the highest frequency, followed by the second highest amount of priority. Consistency and closures, we'll talk about what that means in a second, was at 21, followed by 12, followed by individualization, community engagement, and discipline and restorative practice, followed by, in descending order after that, equity, community partnerships, magnets, student experience, and class sizes. So in that same way, the nuance of what this was specifically referring to in this chart, in that same order. So staff experience referred to the experience of campus staff, focused on things like workload, retention of high quality instructors, the effectiveness of personal and professional development, with a particular emphasis on supporting teachers and making sure they have the resources needed to educate students. The second one around consistency and closures refers to a desire for consistency in the community. So while it does include mentions of closures related to shifting of schools and feeder patterns, the real heart of what was discussed in this was that we need consistency. So whatever the board does and whatever happens in the district, how do we make sure there is consistency and consideration of school performance as those shifts are undertaken? This was a really interesting point that I just want to make here, is that at the heart of each of these buckets are, again, the values. They are what we as a community hold dear, and they are purposefully, we asked this in a way to really try to make sure that we got to the value of this, not the how we do something. How you accomplish academics or how you improve staff experience, there's a million ways to go about that. And every person is going to have their own individual ideas. The goals with these, again, whether staff experience or consistency in closures, is to identify what the value is. We want consistency, and then identify how we're going to know if we're making consistency, and then empower the superintendent and staff to put the strategy together to accomplish those things. That's why we hire our staff. So that's why you'll very rarely hear mention of one specific thing that you must do this way. The goal here is to identify the values. The third value was around individualization. This was anything about how do we make sure kids have what they need regardless of where they're at. And it included mentions specific like tutoring or targeted interventions, or just making sure that it wasn't one size fits all, whatever that looks like. The next was community engagement, a really a value around maintaining community events, creating an inclusive atmosphere where families and community members feel like they are welcomed into schools by district and staff, and that their voices are heard. There were ideas and examples that folks put out that they thought this was a really good idea, like family nights or other ways to build local school community. And then the fifth one was discipline and restorative practices. And there was a lot of folks saying to keep the restorative practices work that has been supporting students that Pittsburgh has moved forward on. So there was a notice around those type of things. And then also tied at 17 with frequency was equity. Specifically ensuring programs and funding and resources are allocated in an equitable manner, strategically placed to make the biggest impacts on students who need it most. So again, this is just what was heard in the summary. But let me just pause before we open it for discussion about the content here. Are there any questions about clarifying what was meant by something or how this was put together, or any kind of behind the scenes questions on how to look at this before we get into discussion? And Tracy, I don't know if you would like to call on folks, or would you like me?
You can go ahead and call in people. That's
All
fine.
right, we'll go on the order that I see it on my screen, which is Emma, followed by Ayel and Devin.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for doing all the hard work of coding all of this stuff. I just have one question on the community guardrails, and sorry if you hear my toddler, my infant banging in the background. So when we look at individualization and we look at equity, how do we think about those with relation to, like, I'm thinking about our students with exceptionalities, students with disabilities, and also our gifted students. Do we consider those, are those coded more as falling under individualization, or are those focused more on equity, just as we try to think about prioritization here?
So what I will say is, in these two, there wasn't, while some of it might be like they might be coded in that, if they were said special education, like I want us to, like, the value I have is making sure we focus on and make sure we have really strong special education program, which could very well be a value.
Yeah.
That was coded under special education, which didn't meet the threshold to come out.
Oh, okay.
The same thing with gifted and talented. There was mention of gifted and talented, but again, it fell below the 10 threshold, so it might not have been here. I'll send, we can just for transparency purposes, put it out where we see the lower numbers. I just, for the summary, didn't want to put them there, so we can post that. But those two explicitly would have been in a different category. But these were really around, if someone had said something like, I have a gifted and talented student, I want to make sure our students really get what they need regardless of whether they're gifted and talented or otherwise, that would fall in individualization.
Gotcha. Okay.
This was much more, both of these were much more broad.
Gotcha. I see what you're saying. Yeah, and definitely would like to see all of the data, which I'm sure is one of Director Silk's questions. If I can anticipate her questions, I'm sure that was one of them.
Yeah, I will put the extended one with the additional buckets and the lower numbers in there for y'all to share and see.
Cool. Thanks, Ben.
You guessed correctly. That was one of my questions. So thank you, Ben, for already offering to share the fuller data set. So I had two questions about how this is put together. The first is, it looks like you did not weight any of the data to adjust for the fact that, at least on the prioritization side, if for that data, for the folks who showed up in person, that prioritization was done in groups.
Correct.
And therefore has like a little bit more weight to that. There could have been disagreement within that group, but ultimately a group of folks came up with a prioritization. So is that correct, though, that there's no weighting in this data?
That's true, but I did break out where you see sermons and prioritization to the right, meetings. So you can choose to weight it however you wish with that data. But if you look at the far right column, the pink, so that will be meetings. And what you'll notice is the trend is roughly there, but there are definitely some things. So at the meetings, 14 was around community partnerships. That was weighted a little bit heavier at meetings. So it's definitely something to take into account. we don't have just one like method to do it. So I put the data here and y'all can choose to use it and weight how you see fit.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to lift that up, and in your review of it, you didn't notice any kind of like extreme differences from the survey to the in-person that stood out to you.
I mean, it's hard to tell candidly because what you're looking at is between 14 and 12 or 2. So there's not a huge range. You're not working with numbers of 1,000 like some districts actually might.
Yeah.
So it's harder to tell, but like there are definitely differences to the point here, and it's more pronounced on the values, and it always is because it's a wider range of things that people want to share about. But like, for instance, the one that stands out to me here is the 14, like there are 14 mentions in the groups on community partnerships specifically, but only 2 on the surveys. So that tells me there was a difference in discussion there. But something like staff experience across the board at the top was mentioned equally by people in the survey, people in the groups that kind of came up to the top. You will see less variation on the vision you want students to know and be able to do. There's a little bit like personal agency down here as 16, but it still doesn't rise to the top like some of the other ones do that have essentially the same amounts in the survey or the meetings.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful. So the counts are all there and they're all like a pure count, but we know how we came to that data. So if we choose to treat particularly on the second question, those responses differently, knowing how we got there, we could decide to do that as a board. My last question, and I keep trying to scroll, but that's your screen share, not my version of it.
Good to go.
That's not how computers work. I wanted to know for the values piece, is there a way of capturing, I mean, I could guess this, but is there a way of capturing for those, what was the temperature in the responses around wanting more of, this was an avoid category, this was a we want more of it, like, so that we have a sense of, because at least the meeting where I was at, it was interesting to hear what folks thought the like current state was, if it was a like avoid versus keep at all costs versus this is something that we don't have and needs to be added.
So we don't have it broken up that way because of it. People's experiences are different in different schools, in different neighborhoods, in different classrooms. So I think you can see this in some of what complicates that is someone might go and say, you need to keep the great teachers you have because my daughter's 3rd grade teacher was amazing. And someone else says, we're losing all of our teachers. We need to keep our great teachers. Those are 2 totally different experiences. One keep, one avoid, but they both are speaking to the same value. It's just their own anecdotal experience is a little different. So we don't have that data broken up that way. That's why we tried to bucket it into the value, because both of those parents are speaking about the exact same thing they want. They just had different experiences and what got them there. So I don't think it's actually going to be as clean as you would want it to be in terms of keep or avoid. There are specific ones. So I can tell you the ones that are specific to Pittsburgh Public Schools, and I will just do this from my own experience here, is community partnerships. We're all referring to keeping specific types of community partnerships that were happening in schools in the community. Magnets were also, I mean, I assume obviously you have magnet schools, and there are folks who responded that said, we want to keep our magnet schools. That is a Pittsburgh specific thing. Student experience was not student specific. So you're not going to get a yes or a no that keep or avoid that. Depends on the experience of that. And then what I also gleaned, and this was less clear, but it seemed like there is definitely a trend in the responses of discipline and restorative practices that Pittsburgh has embarked down this path. And most folks there were speaking about specific things they wanted to keep seeing in schools as it relates to that. The other ones were definitely much more broad and is just based on the specifics.
All right, that's helpful as I continue to wrap my brain around this data set. That's it for me. Thank you.
And if you don't mind, before we go to Devin, I think you made a great point here, which is this is just the best. This is a messy process because everyone wrote all kinds of different things and responded in different ways. That's the beauty and the messiness of an open survey. So I am not here to advocate to look at this one particular way or another. Like that is fully in my estimation, the council's estimation. That's the role of the board. Y'all heard different things while you were there, and how this all fits. And so this is just one element to look at as you inform your priorities. We will go to Director Taliaferro.
Thank you, Mr. Mackey. So I don't really have much questions at this stage, but I did want to acknowledge, because when you started the meeting, you mentioned about this information should be public.
Sure.
I don't believe that it is. At least I cannot find it on our website. And so I just want to make note of that, that it should be public and it should be present. On our board page, there's just a link to the survey, which is no longer active. So I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that, because as we are going through this process, you know, there's steps that we need to take and make that. I'm not seeing it. So if it is on the website, if somebody can identify where that is, just so that it's clear to the public where they can find this information, both during this meeting and afterwards. So that's all.
That makes a ton of sense, and I can circle back with board services and whatnot. I've seen districts do it any number of ways. I've definitely seen the community appreciates it. They came to these meetings, they made their voice heard, and to hear back from the board say, hey, here is the summary. And we're gonna, as we set these priorities, we're gonna come back to you and ask you about our priorities. Did we hear you correctly, etc. So I think that's a great point. Thank you for flagging that. Director Walker.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you, Director Taliaferro, for pointing that out. I was actually that was my comment. Normally we don't publish these things prior to the presentation, because I think we try to avoid sharing information without context first. And so generally that stuff gets posted the day after, but I'm working with communications and the board secretary to see if we can't get this document published sooner rather than later. But generally it comes out the day after. I just wanted to clarify kind of why we do that. So that was it. I didn't have any other comments other than I heard the same thing, and then I asked someone where it is, and they said we don't do it till afterwards, and then that made sense, because it's our normal practice not to put the information out prior to the actual presentation.
All right. Director Wilson, followed by Director Reed.
Sylvia Wilson, as opposed to Director Sylvia Wilson.
Yes, ma'am.
It's my own personal yuck. I wanted to say, yes, that would be correct. It would be kind of horrible that this information would have been posted without us having a chance to have a discussion first. But not a question again. I think that this process is important. We've been talking about this, and I've been through the training, and it is a necessary thing to do. It's just unfortunate that it occurred at the same time that we're discussing the facilities plan, because some people came to these sessions with only the facilities presentation in their mind. We lost a few people who were upset because it's not what we were talking about, and some others slipped in some things that had to do directly with the facilities plan. I kind of am curious, if it wasn't going on at the same time, might we have had more people come out? I was actually personally disappointed in the numbers of folks who did come to the sessions. And I'm kind of almost afraid that once these are publicly posted, that the next biggest criticism is, oh, gee, look at these few people who came out, and you're going to make plans based on these few little people. Again, it's good information. I know that in the two forums, actually I've been in 3 forums, in the 3 that I think there was a lot of good participation from those who were there. But I guess because of my experience, I'm steeling myself for the criticism that I expect to hear soon. That's it for me.
Thank you, Sylvia. Let me, if I may, the good news here is this is not and does not have to be a one and done. And you're absolutely right. The context in which a board holds community listening sessions always has some impact on what is said and what's top of mind. It is the nature of it, no matter what. But I have two thoughts that could be helpful for this. This is only a starting point. If folks are still out there, they can still reach out to you. And I think it's the board's prerogative to decide to say, hey, if you also have other thoughts, if some of these things are like, yes, I agree with that, or I don't, feel free to let us know. Send me an email. You all are all constantly taking this into account. The second thing is, while this is one element, it's not the only element. It's not like you all are going to go in there and say, all right, well, the top 5 things, those are the top goals that we're going to do. You definitely don't have to do that. You're going to be taking into account all these other things. And it's always our recommendation that once you get a draft of the kind of priorities that you want to set. So if you say, we want to set a literacy priority, and this is kind of how we're thinking about it right now. It's always our recommendation that there's another set. You show them back out to the community. You could choose to do another set of listening sessions. You could get feedback on them through a survey or whatnot. So there's other opportunities, and you can create a consistent set of opportunities. And then it's our long-ranging recommendation, and the board will, again, choose what it wants to do, that these shouldn't only happen once at the beginning of the priorities. There should be a way to, have a set of community listening sessions next year and say, like, hey, here's how the first year is going. Here's what we're hearing, what's not. Tell us about what you're hearing about, what's working, what's not working. And it can be a constant conversation that builds more trust with the community, as I think so often I've seen in school systems where the school system goes out to the community and asks them something because they want community feedback, but then they never follow up on that. And there's not a two-way back and forth. So I think you have the opportunity to build something truly special there, that it is an ongoing conversation. Excuse me. Okay, Tracy.
Yeah, my questions are sort of along the same lines. If you look at Pittsburgh Public as an example of other districts that you've worked with, is the participation similar? And are there best practices in, increasing the amount of participation that we get in our in this whole process? But moving forward, are there things that we should be thinking? You don't have to name those things, but do you have like an arsenal of things that we should be thinking about and doing in order to increase participation?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to say it is or it isn't. I would say most of the ones range between around 200 to 3,000 is the, kind of the range in which they fall. There are definitely some outliers. I think Charlotte Mecklenburg had more than 20,000 people respond. But I think a big thing to keep in mind is school systems are radically different sizes. And so, another school system that I'm working with currently is around 40,000. They had about 1,000 responses. So just given the size, you might expect to be around 500 responses or so. So it could have been a little bit low. But also it comes like, again, this isn't the only way to get this. As far as the strategies, the things that I see that have the biggest impact are lots of communication from the district wide about like, hey, this is our survey, and doing it in different ways, not just putting it on social media, but sending a flyer home with every kid. Actually asking principals at their upcoming staff meeting in the next month and a half, make sure all of your staff has the opportunity to fill out this survey. Or do the same thing with your high schools and middle school students. Can you find 15 minutes sometime over the coming 2 months and have students respond about their own experiences? So when you build those things, and that can drastically change your amounts. It's definitely true that the hardest group to reach are community members and parents who might not be paying attention to social media in the same way, and you don't have them as a captive audience. But then that also just really comes to, honestly, it seems like quantity of, this is what we're doing. Please fill out the survey. Please show up at this meeting, etc. I would say, just based on my own experiences, that your average turnouts seemed relatively normal compared to most of people that are showing up. We usually see between 15 to 40 people at those meetings. After that, it kind of gets unwieldy. I think the survey was a little lower than what I usually see. And I think that's just a matter of, did we, how are we analyzing and using all channels to get that information out and making it an active part of what we do? But to each system is radically their own. I think y'all would be much better situated than I to determine if this is kind of where it's been in the past, or if folks might be burnt out from a lot of community meetings already, so they might like, I can't really judge that, but you'll definitely can. All right. Seems like we're there. So I'm gonna take this off and I'm just gonna open up the floor. I would love to just hear if anyone has any thoughts or action. We're not making any kind of decisions. This is just one artifact and information to see, was there anything surprising, or is there anything that was like, yeah, I've heard this a lot, and now to see it show up in the data, that's there. So I'll open it up to whomever wants to kind of share and discuss. Sylvia.
I personally was not surprised. I think sessions that I've had in the past, over the years I've been on the board, when we have had community sessions that dealt with this, it just wasn't as the total school board, but it was specific to certain schools. And basically, it's the exact same kinds of responses that I've seen before. A little bit more CTE emphasis now than before, but the people are finding some reality in that.
Yep.
And I just want to say, I think that sometimes in terms of special needs kids or gifted, the attention is there, but we sometimes forget all the other kids. I know we have to educate everybody, and sometimes the emphasis is on a smaller group than the whole. And I've seen that as a school board member, and I saw it as a teacher as well. So these responses are pretty much this. I could almost go back 5 years ago and pull out papers, and I would find very much the same.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful statement. So how do we then define this in a way that we're gonna make some difference and our community sees a change here or there? And I think what you uncovered in one of your statements there, which really is to say, it's like, how wide or how narrow do we scope this? You can focus on smaller groups, you can focus on all students. You gain something and you lose something, no matter where you decide. That's going to be one of the biggest challenges that this board will face as it decides when it sets a goal or sets a value, how narrow to focus. You can get more attention there, or how wide to make it and get more breadth to it. So if you decide that literacy is something we want to focus on, are you going to narrow it to a particular grade level that is the linchpin, or a particular student group, or a program? Or are you going to make it wider? There's benefits and costs to all of that, but that's something that this board will get to discuss through. And that's
That's
the
correct.
meaningfulness.
I agree.
Thank you. Emma.
Yeah, thanks. I second what Sylvia said about, I think that this community listening just puts onto paper and in an organized way a lot of the things that I've heard from community members, and it makes it a little bit more organized. Like Sylvia said, I wasn't particularly shocked at anything, and I also wasn't shocked that the guardrails around not closing schools rose to the top. Like Sylvia said, that was something that I'd highlighted at the beginning of this process, that I was worried that the timing of having these community listening sessions with everything else that's going on was going to skew the community listening session results. And I think it probably did. And that's not a bad thing. That's the thing that's at the top of everybody's mind, but that makes sense. I have a question, and Ben, if I'm jumping way too far ahead, just tell me to hold it for the future. But my question is, how do you recommend us as a board taking this and actioning it? And if you want to have discussion first with other folks and then we get into that at the very end, that's fine too. But that's the thing that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, I think so. I have an answer for you on that. The nuance and how you all do that will be your decision. But overall, what we recommend is a workshop. And usually it's a 4 to 6 hour workshop, depending on how much folks want to talk. Half of it focus on really defining the goals, the vision, and half of it focus on defining the values.
Yeah.
And the way we usually structure that is you'll have homework out of this. Is eventually, Dr. Walters will have a similar presentation to say, hey, all right, here were the goals that we did this year. Here are any adjustments or non-adjustments that I'm recommending for next year. He's also going to recommend some of these values that might rise to the top for him based on what he has seen with his entire team in the system. So that's going to be another insight. You'll have your superintendent and the administration's recommendations. And then from that, we will facilitate, myself and Ray will facilitate essentially a workshop setup in some way where we will start you off individually and then move to smaller groups and eventually
Yeah.
coalescing around just the big picture things. What are those big things we want students to know and be able to do? Social skills or this or that, or maybe a particular element, financial literacy. And then we're going to force the conversations between two of you individually to try to, all right, if you had to prioritize between that, what would they be? And eventually try to get the board onto the same page on the big picture. We want to focus on literacy, mathematics, critical reading, financial literacy, social skills. Okay, then the next phase of that, once we kind of get some assessment there, is how do we then start defining, like, what are the specifics? Like, what social skills? What do we mean by that? And so then it's an iterative process to really get specificity to it. At some points, the board will then hand that back off to the administration, who's going to have to figure out, how do I organize my system around social skills? If that's what the board decides, they're going to do some research, come back with ideas and best practices, and that will be the conversation that kind of goes forward. But we will help you all take these from big to smaller, starting with the workshop, then everything kind of rolls from there. And all of those, our recommendation is that it's public, so the community can hear the process. The board can have meetings where folks can share feedback on, hey, I heard this sounds great, we love it, or consider this. So that's kind of how this goes.
Cool. That makes sense to me. Thanks. So then my next question, I was going to maybe direct it at Dr. Walters, but he's not on. So I guess I'm going to direct it to Jean or anybody else who can answer this. But right now we are in the process of evaluating the superintendent for this year and setting his goals for next year. And that is supposed to happen in the next like 2 to 6 weeks. I know the evaluation has to happen by the 15th, and then I think we have a few weeks to set goals. I imagine it will be difficult to find a time in the next 2 weeks for all of us board members to get together for 4 hours. But yeah, Jean, I guess my question is, what are our plans for expediting this process or using this information to incorporate in the superintendent's goals for the next year? Because I would hate for us to have all of this great information and then wait until next summer to then incorporate it into his goals. Do we have a plan for that?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I mean, we can, once we get through, obviously next week in graduation, and I think we can schedule that workshop as soon as it fits the board schedule. We don't, because we still work over the summer, so there's not really a summer break. So we can do something probably towards the end of June if we can figure out a time that works for everyone to do that. I'm trying to think, and Ira can probably let me know for sure when the approval of the superintendent's goals has to happen for the next round, and if we have, and that'll inform us of kind of what our time frame is for getting this workshop started and this work going forward. Ira, do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I'm looking, sorry to jump in, but I'm looking at the memo that Ira's office sent us. So no later than June 1st, the superintendent is supposed to submit to the board his priorities. And then the next step is for us to meet no later than June 15th to discuss and agree on priorities, which become his performance priorities. Yeah, so it sounds like by June 15th, we should have all of that. I realize that we're running up against that. But that's the
but it's also, I mean, it's also possible, and Ben, you would know better than anyone because you've done this before. I mean, it's also possible that this goals and guardrails conversation is kind of a moving target that will kind of have its own kind of legs as we do this work, because we may come back, even if we meet it in the third week of June, we could come back with something and then get public comment that says, no, we missed the mark, and have to kind of try again. Do you have a sense for that, Ben, of like how long that process takes?
I will answer from a practical standpoint, and then of course I'm not a lawyer, so consult the lawyers on contractual obligations and state law. But overall, every superintendent that I know wants to be on the same page as their board. Like that is beneficial for everybody involved. So even if by contractual obligations or whatnot, the board adopts goals for the superintendent by the June 15th deadline, if there's sometimes there's an opportunity to say, hey, is there a way we can get an extension for an extra month or 2 months. That's an opportunity, but that's a discussion. But then I think there are plenty of ways to do this. The overall time, from the time you do the workshop, usually what it takes is one workshop, and we will have you all to having defined out in broad sense what your priorities are, both your goals and your values. What you won't have yet is like the specific measure and from what to when, because some of that you might have to, I've seen districts say, we're going to focus on social emotional learning. And then they go, how do we measure that? We don't know. We're going to consult people. And so some of those measures take a little bit longer. Some of them, most oftentimes people use a statewide literacy assessment. So you have that tomorrow. Like you could actually roll with that pretty fast. Some of the other ones you choose to do might be a little bit longer. There's usually a back and forth. Usually the board will then hand it over to the administration. Administration within a month can start getting ideas on like, all right, here's how we think, you said staff experience is important. Here's what we think are the most meaningful measures of staff experience. We're going to do a climate survey and we're going to look at teacher turnover rate. And then it's a conversation you can decide on where you kind of go from there. That usually from the time the workshop happens, I would say most boards get it adopted and go public within the next 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how fast they want to move.
Okay. There is a precedent that with this superintendent for having a mutual extension of these deadlines. We've done that in the past. So I think when the board next meets with Dr. Walters, it can have a conversation about adjusting these deadlines to make the whole process more meaningful. So that would be my response.
Yeah, then thanks for that, Emma. I think maybe then the next step is let's talk to Dr. Walters and see if we can't agree on maybe a July 30 extension that will give us, 7 weeks to kind of, and my sense is that he's pretty close, but I think there are some of like the social and emotional stuff that may not be as present in his goals, as we want them. So I think maybe that's the next step. Is let's talk to Dr. Walters and his team to see if we can't agree on a mutual extension date, and then work towards having everything finalized by then, if that's agreeable to the rest of my board colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I just want to make sure that we're like using this information, and I agree with you that of course these goals are moving targets. I think that's the nature of these qualitative goals, is that we will continue to refine them over the next 2 years until we do a community listening session. I just want to make sure that we're taking this information that's supposed to guide both our board governance work and the work of the superintendent over the next 2 years, and using it in a timely manner to inform both our own performance as a board and the superintendent's.
I 100% agree with you.
Cool.
And I will add, I've had other boards do this. They've been in the same predicament, especially if the superintendent is able to agree to that extension to get something. What I've seen, essentially boards will inevitably come up with some goals and values that are really easy. We can know it today and know what the 1-year target is. Others, we're going to take us 6 months to build. And so there's kind of an onboarding period. I've worked with a board recently. They essentially said, well, these are the 3 out of the 5 goals that we're ready for. So we're going to adopt those as this year goals. And out of our 4 values, we're going to adopt 3 of those because we have those ready. The other 1 value and the other 2 goals, it's going to take some time to build. So we expect you to build them over the course of the year. And we're still going to report publicly on like what we're doing and how it's aligning, even though we don't have targets yet. And then next year, when we do the same process, we will then adopt all of them because we'll have them all by that point. So that way it keeps it still moving. The public still hears, you all will still monitor. So if you choose to focus on something social, emotional related, even though you don't have it built out, you're still probably going to set up a time where every quarter you're going to get an update on what's the progress and what's the best estimate we have. Let's have a discussion around that, even though we don't have the targets yet and we won't have them to the end of the year. So you can do those in hybrid manner and make sure that the superintendent still has like whatever measurable priorities are going to be the priorities this year. Those can move forward, and the other ones are kind of a placeholder for 6 months or a year until they are determined.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Ayel, followed by Devin.
Thank you. I am building off of this conversation. I +1 requesting that extension, and that makes sense. I did want to make sure that even with requesting an extension and hopefully getting a positive response to that it sounds like the next step regardless is still Dr. Walters presenting the goals that he shared with us, because that's like another data set for us to be considering. We have the community data, then we would have Dr. Walters and his team's data. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And given that he wasn't going to be here today, I was able to connect with him late last week, and he's already underway with that.
Yeah.
So that should be available sometime shortly.
Yes.
Again, I believe he's already submitted goals. He may
He
say,
has,
well,
yeah.
change one of these. He might say that those are still the ones and here's why. And that is what it is. And then he's going to definitely talk about those values and which of those are rising to the top and ways he might consider measuring them. That can be, we'll connect with him. And I know we have Lamar on the line also, can connect, but that should definitely happen shortly. I've also seen it happen where we scheduled a workshop date, and then he presents it at the beginning of the workshop, and that's just the starting point of the workshop. That could work too. So we don't have to necessarily wait to have another one of these meetings and him present and then schedule a workshop. You all can choose to move forward as soon as you want on that.
Okay.
And then that would just be the deadline for when that gets turned in.
Sure. So I am just bigger picture trying to make sense of these various pieces, all of which seem really important, and I'm not 100% sure how they fit together. So I'm hoping that you can help me out, or invite my board colleagues to share your thoughts on this. So we have this effort that we've begun around setting our board priorities. We have Dr. Walters' goals that he's submitted to us. And then we also, as a number of us have been mentioning, have the district restructuring process. And I am wondering, I'm wondering about just recommendations for how we navigate those three, and in particular around the restructuring, to what extent this work on goals and priorities can influence, shape how we update the public in meaningful ways throughout the restructuring process, should the board vote to proceed.
For sure. I will just kind of give a high level what I've seen in districts and my single biggest recommendation. Then I would love to just open it up to your board colleagues and see if they have other thoughts here. My biggest recommendation is to separate out what do we want the outcomes to be that are going to tell us we've won the game from anything related to the how we do that work. So oftentimes like that represents itself in like, what are the goals? What are the constraints or the values or the guardrails, whatever we call them, and how are we going to know if we made it or not? Separate from, oftentimes, in your case, it's the facilities plan, but oftentimes it's the strategic plan. A lot of folks come in and say, I care about this strategy or this way, et cetera. And it is always our coaching to separate. What are you trying to achieve before you get to the strategies? Because people oftentimes to get into the strategies of that work. And the strategies might be good or bad. It's who knows. They're only good or bad dependent on what you've done as an outcome. So in a perfect world, we would coach you all to set your priorities first and then put together your facilities plan, your strategic plan, et cetera. But we also recognize this is not a perfect world, and we're finishing one year, opening another year. There's real decisions to be made. You've got to build the plane and fly it at the same time. And so I would just in this process, try to separate out the decisions we're making on the how, that most of which start with administration, but some require board decisions, et cetera. Separate that from these priorities. But once you get these priorities, as soon as you all start to get clear on a set of priorities as a board, even if it's not set in stone, then start using those priorities to think about your decisions and whether those decisions are going to get you closer to achieving those priorities or not.
You're muted.
Devin? Sorry. I didn't know if people wanted to respond to that, but I know Devin had her hand up next. And I don't know if you finished.
I am done. I would love to know if there are other board members who have thoughts about the
Yeah.
the relationship among those three sets.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with Devin. She may or may not, and then others feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Ben. So I guess if I just take a stab at what you're asking, I think just from my experiences at least in the in-person session that I did, because I did one virtual and one in-person, and I think the in-person session obviously functioned a lot differently in terms of being able to really have.
Devin, you accidentally muted yourself.
I didn't do it. The computer muted me. So at any rate, I don't know what you heard or what you didn't hear, but I guess the point I want to make, I guess, is that I draw from the in-person session that I did because I actually had more engagement with people in that space. And I think it's really tricky. And I appreciate what Director Yord, brought up, because it is very tricky making a decision to do this community engagement that we've never done like this as a board for ourselves. At the same time that we're having these other conversations and other meetings that have really taken the focal point, and should, because transitioning and changing a school district of over 18,000 students is major, and can't be taken lightly, but I think it's in some of the ways has been maybe not taken in consideration, that's a major haul for everybody, on top of just the community feeling kind of tossed in the wind. So I think in the conversations that I had with people is that while trying to keep it separate, at least the conversation around restructuring the district, while trying to keep it separate, I think some of the concerns that come up are just things that people just lack understanding and lack knowledge of in the district, because we don't do maybe the best that we can to communicate things in layman's terms, or in ways that people really understand, or how they can be both connected and disconnected at the same time. So I think it is a tricky beast in where we're at. At the same time, this work is really important to set the tone for the future and how this board operates. So I understand how we need to move forward. But it does make it very challenging to separate at least those two things. I can't remember what the third thing that you asked about, but nonetheless, I'll just get into my comments that I wanted to actually share. So much like what Director Wilson / Sylvia, I know you don't like the formal titles, but what I think what she brought up to me, I think I'm was very challenged by understanding the circumstances, but still very challenged by not getting necessarily a turnout to both physical and virtual events and survey responses. I don't think it's something to celebrate because it's low. And, in a district where, like, again, we serve over 18,000 students, like, I know that community engagement is challenging for us as a district as a whole, but there's been so much community engagement and so much tension and stress over all these different conversations that we're having, that I think I would have liked to hear or see, more engagement. But with that being said, I think the people that did come out were very thoughtful and very intentional about how they wanted to contribute to this process. So that is something that I want to acknowledge and celebrate, because there were people who really came to this conversation, to this table, to say, like, okay, like, how can we be a part of setting the tone and building goals and constraints for how this district moves forward and what we really want to see for our students. One thing that I want to note and that was brought up to me was how we handled individual responses, more in particularly to the in-person, but really to the surveys as well, because oftentimes we get people who come to multiple sessions. So I'm not sure, was that taken into consideration, Ben, when the data was being sorted of like people who might have attended multiple events?
So if they were at events, no, because even if the person was at an event, the events were captured in terms of those group pages. So their group conversation might have been entirely different. It might have landed in different ways. So the groups were the same. As far as the surveys, we did not explicitly like make people put in an email address, which would allow us to understand if they were exactly the same person. But I will tell you, reading the survey, there was very few that were like, there was none that were exactly the same, people multiple times doing it. We would have excluded them if it was just copy and pasted again. Sometimes, and that's not even malicious. Sometimes people just don't know if they finish the survey and they do it again. But overall, the survey responses seem to be very distinct and different folks. Now, it's not to say it would just be a lot of work if one person had done a whole bunch of differently worded responses. I don't believe that happened, especially not to any degree.
Thank you. I think that is something obviously to take into consideration as we continue to do community engagement. I would be interested to understand a little bit better, not necessarily right now, but as we move forward in this process, to understand what additional engagement could look like, or what that, like how that could unfold, to make sure that we continue to, at least in a time frame, continue to be engaging with constituents and gleaning information and vision and value from community beyond even just parents in the district. This is something that I think I've seen come up multiple times in both conversations I see online and conversations I have with people in person, is really just the difficulty or the challenge of people not feeling like they receive the information, or people beyond parents. Like, so we, when we're utilizing the district to get the word out about, things like community engagement and anything that we do, we kind of utilize those channels that reach parents in the district, but not necessarily always reach community members, like people who just genuinely care about, children and education, but maybe don't have kids actively in the district. And I know that comes up a lot, even during election time, when people, like when you're knocking on a door and people have no clue about anything about the school board because they don't have children, or they don't have a direct connection to the district. So I would be interested in how we can better engage community beyond, just like I said, beyond parents or staff in the district or even students, because those are like low-hanging fruit to me. But the harder people to reach are the people who have no direct connection with the school district, but would still bring a lot of value. And there were a couple people at the session that I hosted at Sunnyside. There were a few people who were just general community members who just cared enough to show up and, maybe heard about it through their neighbor or something like that.
Yeah. And
And
I would say, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, and I don't know if you, in your, experiences of doing this work, if there were ways that might have worked in other districts and how they engaged community members.
Yeah. So I can there are definitely some of these. I think what is the most common is boards generally rely on the district communications department to communicate out through the regular channels. But that, to your exact point that you raised, they have a specific audience of folks who are paying attention to the district communication channels. The districts that I've seen that have been most successful in engaging a wider community the board takes a much more active role in this. Board members, especially elected ones, do this every couple of years when they run for election. They build community relationships. They talk to neighborhood associations. They go out to local churches and community centers, et cetera. And so I've seen boards and board members actually like be very intentional about, okay, I'm going to make sure that every single relationship that I have, all the YMCAs, the churches in my neighborhood and precinct, I'm going to get the word out to directly to them. We're going to do some time, like, it's like pre-meeting. Like, I'm going to go to these churches on Sunday and tell them about this community listening session we're going to have and why it's important their voice shows up, even if they don't have students in PPS. So I've seen that happen a lot. The other big one I see is like utilizing partner organizations, community networks, and partner organizations that Pittsburgh Publics might work with or know, like really pushing those organizations and bringing them into the fold, saying, hey, we'd love for you to be here. What I've seen also is like they can, one, oftentimes be great partners to their networks and share out what you all are doing and the cadence of this, et cetera, to their entire network. I think about some early learning institutions that are hitting the pre-K providers, people that aren't even in Pittsburgh Public yet, but are going to have a very big say one of these days shortly, like utilizing that. I've also seen boards actually have specific sessions for all the community partners. So we're going to actually invite all the community partners to come out and bring not their own personal thoughts, but their organizational thoughts about what do you want to see from Pittsburgh Public Schools. So there's different ways to do that, but I think oftentimes that requires a board setting up a structure that does not rely on the district communications staff to communicate, because they have one audience and it's a different audience from the one that the board members typically have.
Thank you for that, Ben. And that actually sparks like a lot of thought. Because I remember when we were going through this process and gleaning information and like who we wanted to be a part of these things, we talked about community partners and organizations, but I'm not certain if the information about these sessions got to those people. We never did anything with those groups that we recommended. So I'm just curious about what that might look like for future. And I think what's really important to me in this with this process is that as a board that we actually and whether it comes from starts in executive leadership and then figured out and then goes down to the rest of the board before moving forward. But I think that we need to have a little bit better of a setup and a game plan for what this engagement should look like and can look like in the future. I think that it's great to have the support of the administration and the communications team, but they are stretched very thin and already do a lot of heavy communication. And where I feel, and this is just my honest opinion, and I always advocate and support our staff, but I feel like the ball got dropped in communicating a lot of this. There were times where I didn't even see it on social media unless I posted about it. And so, or it was after the fact, or there was some sessions that were posted and some were not. And there was no consistency. And I think consistency being a theme that people really appreciate and value in this district, and what community often seeks is having some kind of consistent understanding and communication. I think that's an area of growth for us as a board as we continue to move forward with this work, which is really important to me, because I don't think that we can, once upon a time we did none of this, and so where we're at is a step up and a step better than where we were, but what does it look like to continue to do better and to continue to grow in this area of engagement as a board, so that we're doing what people yell at us every month about, which is transparency, a lack of consistency, and frustration that comes from those things. And I want this process to reflect what community is actually telling us, and they tell us a lot about what they want. So I'm hoping that we actually listen to what they say, and that is reflected in how we move forward in this community engagement work. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's exactly the purpose of this conversation. Anyone else? I don't see any other hands raised. Well, if that is where we are at here, so next steps I will get with Dr. Walters and President Walker, and I'm sure they will be reaching out to the board to identify the time for that workshop as soon as possible. And then once we get that scheduled, I'll send out some pre-work to all of the trustees, and I'll also make sure that it'll take me about a day or so to make sure I can put it together. But we'll get the full list of summaries, even if for those that were less than 10 responses, so folks can have that, and you can put that publicly as well. But with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Reed.
Thank you. Does anyone have any final questions, comments? I would just like to say that this, the process is one that I really appreciated being part of. I'm hopeful that we continue to work on community engagement. And I think that there are ways that we can explicitly and implicitly incorporate this work into not just the goals that we set and the superintendent's goals and all of the sort of formal structures, but there are ways that we can hold ourselves accountable to what the public is telling us are the, you know, sort of vision and guardrails around which we should be acting. So it's helpful to have these conversations. I'm hopeful that we continue them, and I'm hopeful that we continue them with increasingly more and more of our constituents, students, and our staff. So are there any other questions or comments or anyone? Okay, well, if that's all, thank you. Oh, Devin, I'm sorry. Director Taillefer.
Thank you. Real quick, and I couldn't get to my reaction. I raised my real hand like anybody was seeing that. So just for clarity, when this information is public, where will it be housed? Will it be housed on our board of directors page, like where the link for the survey was? Will it be housed in the meeting materials for education committee? Can you just make that clear, or if anybody has that clarity, I would appreciate it.
Thank you for that question, Director Taillefer. I'll open the floor up for Director Ebony Pugh to give that information.
Hello. Typically, this is would go in your education committee materials. If you would like us to put it in that area at the top, just so we can do that as well. But it would go in it definitely would go in your education committee materials.
Yeah, I personally, I'm just one of 9 people, but I personally would like to see a space, either a separate tab like we have for the facilities utilization plan, or a space on our board of directors page also for the community engagement information and materials to be housed. And the only reason why I say that is because it's our work. So it should be where we live. I think it also should be where normal things would be. Like, so if this was under education committee, it should be there as well. But in the future, I'd like to like really map out space. Like, if we're going to continue to do community engagement and there's funding in the board budget to do community engagement, and we've never really had a conversation about what that looks like as a board. But if we're going to continue to do more community engagement and be intentional about that work, then there needs to be a space and where that information can be found and communicated beyond.
Yeah, we do have the engagement section too as well on our website, so we could make a section in there about the board, so it sits in the board section, but also people who visit the engagement section could see that information as well.
Yeah, thank you for thinking that through, Ebony. I think that's just really important to have a space where that information lives and board members can put information there. Thank you.
And I would say from a global perspective, as we move forward, after you set these priorities, get off in the new year, rocking and rolling on that. we will actually engage a conversation around the board designing how it wants the community ongoing to look like, both in terms of how it operates, how it's communicated, what the expectations are, and setting that whole thing up. So while right now the board has essentially kind of said, district, we trust your communication, we might have thoughts in that way. It definitely, the board can choose to also communicate on its own in different ways like that, and in a partnership with the administrative staff as well. So that'll be something the board can engage in and build that with the Pittsburgh community.
Thank you, Ben. That ends my questions, Dr. Reed. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Any other questions or comments, board members? Well, thank you all very much. This was very helpful, and thank you, Mr. Mackey, for all your work and for the presentation. If that's all the questions that we have, then this meeting stands adjourned. Everyone have a good night.